global instability. So I welcome you, Pablo, and please take the floor. The floor is yours, and I think you can share your PPT if you have one.
Okay, so I go now. No, it's not Veronica's presentation now?
Yes, we can, yeah.
Okay, sure. There we go then. Let me know if you can see it. Okay. There we go. So thank you so much for this opportunity, especially Professor Cátia, because she was the one involving me in all this. So I really appreciate the invitation, the possibility to participate in this seminar on China studies, and I think it's a great opportunity for all. Also, the online context allows many people from many countries to be involved without major logistic problems. So I really appreciate this. So I'm gonna give a bit of introduction. I want to warn first that this is work in progress. So this is actually I'm finishing my doctoral research, which I'm about to defend it in July if everything goes well. So I'm gonna give some input because, as Cátia mentioned, I'm working on international relations theory. So international relations science started in 1919 with the idea of avoiding all kind of wars, especially with the struggle between in the interwar period. It was the between realism and idealism, and finally the realist hegemony between with the idea of connecting states as the supreme actors in the system. The states are struggling for power, and because political power is the most important one, they are prone to conflict. So in this context, scholars like Schwarzenberger, he mentions that there is an oligarchy of states that are ruling the entire system. But this is something that has not been very something worked normally. They tend to focus on multipolarity, unipolarity, bipolarity, but not so much on the different realms where the power exists, which I differentiate between economic, technological, political, military, and cultural. But there are many world system models, essentially on political and military systems, political and military realm, talking about explaining how great powers are related to each other. Most basic one, balance of power. We're talking about a kind of equilibrium. So it's consider the tool that is used for the preservation of the units. Considering it's based on two ideas as in Morgenthau's theory. First one is that the system is composed by different units. Second, that it's moral or is fair the preservation of all the units in the system, and this is only achieved through equilibrium. Alliances is the main tool to preserve this equilibrium, and alliances can be created to fight against world domination. So there is one power that is exerting influence over the system, and once this has these plans for universal imperialism, universal monarchy. This is also mentioned in the literature. And there are, it's also the possibility that the states are aligned in a context of opposition or competition, if there is a third state involved or not in the competition between great powers. But there is a problem with the balancer, the idea of a state, a unit that is holding the balance, and then is kind of altruistic great power that is actually preserving the equilibrium, because this is actually a contradiction within the realist theory. If all states are struggling for power, why is one state wanting to keep things as they are? The other context, the other model, basic model is power transition theory. The idea is that from a new order, it comes to a new order again through Mobelsky's long cycle power. So the idea that after a global war, there is a world power that is establishing a certain status quo that is benefiting them. Then at a certain point, there is a loss of concentration within that power, then a progressive challenge to the legitimacy of this world power, leading to a new global war, and we start again. But the power transition theory was developed essentially with the idea of a power ascent and decline. The system is static, but power is dynamic. So it's very difficult to consider both things at the time. This is the idea of the hegemon and the challenger is what Alison mentioned in 2011 as Thucydides' trap that has been very cited in the literature since then. But actually, it's exactly the same that Organsky wrote in 1958. So the merit should be given to him with the power transition theory. So it's the idea that if there is a decline in power A and power B is in ascent, there will be a conflict for hegemonical power before A is declining more and losing more of the power advantage they have at the time, and before B gets a consolidation of its power. So it's like the most problematic when there is power parity is the most problematic point in the system. This is also leading to the idea of status quo and revisionism, preservation of the system versus the subversion of the system. And in fact, revisionism is at the end a middle point for realists, because as we saw, it's part of the balance of power with the idea of world domination, and it's part of post-transition theory with the idea of the challenger questioning or subverting the status quo that is not benefiting them. So what is revisionism? In the literature, we have used several, we can see several terms. Kissinger, for example, mentions that they are revolutionary. Organsky mentions they are dissatisfied. Schumann in 1933 was talking about unsatiated states. Morgenthau talked about imperialist states. Actually, they are the only common thing is that they are confronting the status quo. But what is the status quo? That's a hard question, and it's not easy, and this has not been solved in the literature before. So Johnston has this theory when he wrote in 2003 that for the revisionist state, so a revisionist state would be Nazi Germany, but we haven't figured out what are the conditions that made Nazi Germany to become revisionist. So it's not always recognizable. And we believe in the literature, and it has this belief over the decades in the literature, that actually when we will see one revisionist state at Nazi Germany, we will identify, well, it's not that easy. This is why in the literature, especially on classical realism, they have gone through history to post facto identify certain revisionist states. And it's kind of easy. And it's what is happening, for example, with Napoleon, with Hitler, with Mao. But it's not that easy when we talk, for example, of situations like Russian revisionism right now, or Chinese revisionism. And it's the thing of Putin and how Putin is also kind of identified with Hitler. And it was in the case of the picture that is shown on the presentation by the Ukraine state at the beginning of the war. There is also this idea that at the end, the status quo will always be democratic and revisionism will always be authoritarian. This is something that it was perpetuated, especially during the Cold War. I love this quote by Wolfers because it's so easy to see it when they say that status quo have renounced to the use of power, and that's the case of the United States and other like-minded countries. They say that essentially status quo powers are peaceful. But actually they are peaceful because they are benefiting from the system, so they don't want to change. Of course, any change should be derived from war. And he says also that revisionist countries are those that are bent on changing the status quo, if necessary by force, of course, and they pursue a superior power. And he then immediately says that Soviet Union and Red China fall into this category. Of course, on our work in 1959, we need to understand the Cold War context on this. So actually from the theory, there is this idea of regime similarities. So between democracies, there will not be war. While authoritarian states are those that are struggling for prestige and status within the system because they don't get that. But at the end, there is this initial idea as giving ideological connotation to the entire theory, especially with the idea of warmongering states, that they are promoting violence, that they are prone to expansionism, and this is probably not the case. Going super quickly on some of the classical realist accounts, Carr, for example, was explaining that he believed the origin of revisionism in his works during in the interwar period. It comes from the idea that some countries, as Hungary and Germany, were opposing to the Versailles Treaty. They were trying to revise the Versailles Treaty, so they were called revisionists. It's not about changing the entire system. It's not about subversion or promoting violence. That was something that was added in the Second World War. But revisionism at its core was simply the revision of a treaty. And in fact, Carr mentioned that the Axis were not linked because of the fascist character, but because they were dissatisfied about the 1919 settlement and alliances. Schwarzenberger also mentions about the artificial character of peace, so that the victory of status quo powers in the main hegemonic wars, essentially Napoleonic Wars, First World War, Second World War, it's provoking that we see positive the conservation of the system, but there is something that needs to be changed because power is dynamic, as we mentioned. But he also has his bias, especially towards the Germany and the Soviet Union, mentioning that they are black sheep in the system, aggressor states pursuing universal imperialism. So he falls in the same category. Kissinger changes it all. He mentions with the account on the Napoleonic Wars that revisionism is based on a change in the legitimacy principle. So that there is not the immutability of the order, but just that the main conditions, which he believes that is the legitimacy order, it's key to maintain the system. And this is why he says that Napoleon was a revolutionary power, revolutionary actor, according to what he says, but a revisionist power, according to our terminology, because he was unable to find any compromise or recognition of his self-limitation and French self-limitations, especially because he was led by nationalist ideology. Wrong on the other side, this is that it's possible, and he suggests that it should be a way to create peaceful changes to the status quo, because at the end, what we all look for is a peace by satisfaction, so that all states are satisfied within the system, and then this is something to be explored later. But of course, the introduction of polarity and homogeneity also changes some of the idea. So revisionism and dissatisfaction needs to be entangled. Morgenthau, as we mentioned, he was talking about the imperialism, so the idea that states were looking for more resources. Kissinger was talking about the revolutionary principle. Organsky was only talking about power transition. The fact is that in any of those accounts, we come with a term, revisionism, that is under theorized, and this has been said for decades. We understand that it's kind of policy to change its status quo and to make it open to one's demands, but we don't know what this is actually. So power transition is essentially focused on the dissatisfaction with the order created by the last major wars victories. As we see on the picture, the idea that, for example, the United States is controlling the system right now, and those power that are growing, ascending in the system, they want to create a system that is more, that is contemplating their demands. So at the end, if we look for the sources of revisionism, it is dissatisfaction. But of course, it's not only that. What are the causes of revisionism? So according to the model that I am working right now, it will be dissatisfaction, capabilities, willingness, and action. These are the four categories that are provoking revisionism. So dissatisfaction is considered a negative feeling caused by the non-recognition of the status or the privileges to be held according to the global status quo. So it's a thing about perception, expectations, and reality of how you are treated. Of course, there is a subjective character in dissatisfaction that is hard to remove. But it's not only that, because you also need capabilities. So relative human, material, moral resources that can be mobilized. If you get dissatisfaction and no capabilities, is the common idea that is reading of the theory. What if Hitler would have ruled Luxembourg? Probably there would not be Second World War, because you need dissatisfaction to be, again, with some kind of capabilities. But of course, it's not only that. You also need to consider revisionism as a priority in your agenda, in your external agenda, despite the cost of stigmatization, because you are going to be condemned for pursuing this revisionist policy. But it's not only that, you also need actions. Let's say revisionism has to be removed from intentions. You can have an intention to pursue a revisionist policy, but if you don't get any action, you should not be considered a revisionist state. So this leads to the definition that we are working right now on my research. That a revisionist actor is a systemic actor guided by dissatisfaction within the system and acting as a driving force for change in the system. And of course, that creates a huge problem in the case of China, as we are going to see. To finish this theoretical consideration of revisionism, there are also some scholars that have lead with typologies of revisions. The most famous one is Schweller's categories in 1994, when he was mentioning the broad back of the revisionist state to the international relations theory. It was differentiated between lions and lambs as status quo powers, wolves and jackals, revisionist powers. The idea was essentially the important as a systemic actor. So if you are an hegemon, you are prone to you are wanting to defend the status quo, you're a lion. If you are a powerful state that are proposing or suggesting revisionism in the system, you are a wolf. Lambs and jackals are simply minor states in the system that they need to be protected somehow, or they want to get profits from the big mammals in the system. Discussant, he mentions another categories that are orthodox, radical, and revolutionary, depending on the degree of change. But we believe that is not actually true. According to the spiral change, we can differentiate between reformist and radical states, what could be considered more revisionist. According to the execution of the change, if there is, because of the accumulation of changes or just a huge change from the beginning, we can differentiate between evolution and revolution. While depending on the systemic role that you have within the system, you should be a challenger, so something that is actually challenging, subverting, like creating a real quest for change in the international system, or just a resistor. But also, we need to differentiate, as I mentioned at the beginning, the realm for change. So political, military, economic, technological, and cultural ideological. And this is key to understand the case of China. Because China's satisfaction within the system needs to be understood with the context of the system that is created after the Second World War. So China was part of the P5, of course, nationalist China, but it was part of the P5 because it was considered one of the victors in the Second World War. So it got the most privileged position within the system. The problem is that the Chinese Civil War and the rise of the Popular Republic of China, People's Republic of China, it was not recognized in the international system in 1949. And it was this idea of the narrative of the century of humiliation. So it was going back to the situation that they got for 100 years. It was not something new. They were, and I think that picture for 1998, I think it's from 1898. I think it's key, with the idea of China being threatened by weapons from some of European powers. Well, the other option is dealing with Great Britain and the US in terms of trade. So it's clear that China's satisfaction has to do with the unipolar US hegemony in this liberal world, especially after the end of the Cold War. This is why there was this Sino-Russia alliance in the treaty that it was signed in 2001, and it was perpetuated later, with the idea that no power should be hegemonic within the system, making a special reference to the US, but also the idea that the US is affecting some China's regional interests in the Pacific theater. So there is a Chinese transition, because it was at the beginning a non-recognition of the status that it was acquiring as a great power within the system, And then this idea that the Chinese model and the idea that China was foreign Chinese affairs were actually kind of advance of the Chinese model, of the communist model, with this idea of still the Cold War mentality, that it was trying to penetrate politically in some other countries, especially with Africa right now. And I think it's key to understand this, because for China, the problem is that since there is no actual definition of revisionist state, it's so easy to call it China as a revisionist state. But that is creating a stigmatization that China is not what it's looking. And then we go to this problem of the effect of the theoretical problem I described. Why? Well, because I consider that starting essentially with the Beijing 2008 Olympic Games, it goes through a lot of events in the US-China split. From the economic crisis and the connection between, so the idea that Lehman Brothers was kind of affected by Chinese interests, because this is why China was not affected so much by the global crisis in 2008. Then the meetings of the BRICS, the creation of the new development bank, economic Chinese ascent, and in 2011 the pivot to Asia from Obama. Then all the problems with the trade practices, the Belt and Road initiative, originally One Belt One Road, problems with cybersecurity, climate, the South China Sea, the arrival of Trump that changes completely the US-China relations. This idea of, and also Trump mentioning in his national security report in 2017, that China was considered a revisionist state in the system. This idea of the wolf warrior diplomacy of China in the region, and some of the protests that are created because of that, the trade war with the prohibition of Huawei, the 5G. But essentially, I think that one of the big problems is COVID. The fact that Trump was insisting on blaming China, considering the Chinese virus, that was a critical point in China's perception, because it was kind of blamed for a global problem that was existing at the time, and putting all the eyes on her. But also the US protests on the EU-China agreement on investments, the Beijing 2022 Winter Olympic Games, and the idea of the genocide against the Uyghurs. At the end, we come to the Madrid NATO strategic concept, saying that China is a security challenge to the Euro-Atlantic alliance, especially because of the support to Russia after the invasion of Ukraine. So we need to understand China's global agenda. Some of the sinologists I work with, they say that so the Badung Conference is actually the starting point. The five principles for the coexistence of relations made by China is the key to understand the Chinese position within the system. But right now, there are three main goals that China has: the maintenance of the Chinese Communist Party in power, the defense of her territorial integrity, and the search of international justice. Of course, the first two should not be problematic, with the exception probably of Taiwan, considered as a part of the territorial integrity. But it's the third one which creates more problems. So let's say China defend that there should be no interference in domestic affairs, what is written in the UN Charter. But of course, that is problematic when you consider that part of domestic integrity is Taiwan or the South China Sea. But we need to ask here, it's because these areas are national or security sphere of interest for China? Because if it's national, we are talking about effectively domestic affairs, and we need to understand what China thinks about this. But if it's only security, then we are, let's say, troubling a great power right now. So it should not be also something to do in the international system if we want to avoid a major war. But of course, China and the West have a very different vision of the global system, because China believes, with the civilizational views, the long-term view that they have, they believe that the system is in a crisis. And this is something that the West is not recognizing publicly. So for the West, the liberal system and the situation that we have right now, the Eurocentric perspective, is still existing. And for China, it has changed, and it changed decades ago. So for China, what is important is to go against unipolarity. And this is why China is leaving what is considered the rise of the rest. The rest as a contraposition of the West, of course, with this language. So we want to analyze China's revision. Well, the problem, as I mentioned, one of the main problems, theoretical problems, is that if we do not define the realm, it is hard to understand China's revisions, because China is posing right now an economic world challenge, but not military or cultural. Actually, this economic global challenge is the main situation. This is the main challenge priority in Chinese agenda, and this is why the Belt and Road Initiative has been one of the top priorities in the system. The same with the Made in China 2035, and this is this idea of the Chinese penetration in Central Asia and Europe. Of course, that is challenging US hegemony in economic and local affairs. And it's this situation that for the US, it is important to mention that China is a revision state, not recognizing the decline in economic terms, but as a, let's say, a disruptive force within the entire system. And it's not the case. Why? Because for example, if we analyze Deng's policy or Xi's policies, Deng's policy was a reformer. Of course, Xi's policy was also a reformer in the global term, but it could be a radical, like a revisionist perspective on regional affairs. But right now, of course, China is posing through evolution. China is posing at the end with this long-term vision, the idea of the socialist model to be implemented, also the socialist model that has very strong business corporations that can create momentum outside, especially in Central Asia. It has the possibility to, through evolution, create revisions, and it's exactly what is going on. But what is this geopolitical implication of China's rise? Well, this is something that it's very problematic. It is something that we are working right now. Is there any transference between realms? So if you are revisionist in one sphere, you could be a revisionist in another. That's a problem. But what we have figured out is that you need a certain cultural challenge, especially ideological, in terms of a model to be implemented outside your borders, or with a certain nationalism, cultural factor, or set of values that you want to go through. And this is key to understand military ambitions, because without that, you cannot get to military ambitions. So is China posing a cultural challenge right now? I don't think so. And without that, we cannot get to consider China as a revisionist military power. Why? Because we need to understand geography. Of course, China is developing a revisionist policy in terms of military, but regionally, not globally. And if we understand the critical importance according to geopolitics, Mackinder's theory, and so on, yeah, we may consider that at the end it should create a global challenge, but right now it's not the case. So there is no challenge to this unipolar world in terms of military or geostrategic. Why? Because of the problem of military expenditures. Of course, if the US is still the power that is spending more on military with such a huge gap, either we may consider that China is not providing the right data for their military expenditures, which is also always the case on our medic system. But of course, my supervisor says that reality imposes to any kind of idea. And the fact is that China right now cannot challenge militarily the US. So the situation with Russia has changed a bit all this. Why? Because Russia right now, it's posing a military, a direct military revisionism in a key area, at least for Europe. So we need to understand if China and Russia are strategic allies just for temporary alliance to get both their benefits, especially going against US hegemony, or if they are close friends that are going to follow exactly the same path. Well, the launch in April 2022 of the Global Security Initiative by Xi Jinping, it may be a new chapter in global geopolitics, but right now it pertains to the realm of intentions or regional actions, but not global actions. And we need to wait for that. So with the question, the huge question in Chinese studies, at least from the international relations perspective of it will be Taiwan, the next Ukraine. Well, it's hard to say. Of course, China has this idea and this ambition to become just one power in 2049. But right now, it seems that unless it is considered something of territorial integrity, which seems to be the case, but of course it involves the US in the region if they decide to be part of a potential invasion. Right now, with the military situation by China, should not be, let's say, challenging the US with integrating Taiwan in the territorial integrity. So what, to conclude more or less, what are their lessons for the West, according with the analysis of this China's revisionism? Well, the West and this idea of the democratic liberal order on the long term is creating outsiders of the system. It's the idea that if you are not Western, if you are not democratic, if you are not getting some of the filters they set so randomly, you cannot be part of. In previous centuries, it was called civilization. Right now, it's called democratic liberal order. So the good guys. If you are not part of that, of course, you are going to feel the satisfaction somehow. But we are going through also kind of a nationalist wave in Europe, in the US. Is China really an exception? Is Xi Jinping's with the idea of the nationalist revival of China is such a huge exception to some other countries that are existing right now in the world? Well, I believe that there is a double standard with China, because you can follow the Western discourse for recommending peace or war, and they do it so easily that it's really hard to understand what is exactly the situation or the stance of the West towards China. For the US, it's the worst power that can exist right now, is challenging everything sovereign system. It has revolutionary intentions. For the EU, it is kind of economic partner, but of course they don't believe on they defend that China is not protecting human rights, while there are other economic partners that has no problem with the respect of human rights according to the EU. So it's kind of double standard. It's hard to get, hard to understand. But of course, there is this stigmatization of China. So China is considered the part of the authoritarian forces that are somehow eroding democracy in the world. But also, they believe that China is the one getting back to geopolitics. Well, that's not the case. With the US importance or in the Pacific theater, they are promoting the importance of geopolitics. China is right now only developing the sphere of security around her. And of course, we should avoid some of the words that it is used in the NATO strategic concept, which is very problematic in kind of a document like that, we should avoid terms like the China challenge. China is not posing a global challenge for sure. It's not posing a global challenge, especially to the Euro-Atlantic area. So what is after all, like behind all this? Well, it's the idea that China is demanding a place under the sun, and the US is not wanting to give this recognition, or if this recognition, because again, this recognition is CEI-Iscte, it's not given because it's economic. So do you see the economic importance of China right now? It's so easy to see it, but still, this non-recognition is given through the fact that you consider China as a revisionist or as a disruptive factor without explaining what does it mean. To conclude, some food for thought with this presentation. I believe that every research on international relations theory should have these three aspects. So for research, it's important from the Chinese studies perspective to understand the challenge of Chinese revisionism in cultural and military affairs. If it's possible that China is transforming the current economic challenge, global challenge, to a global challenge in cultural and military affairs, especially cultural, because as we said, cultural is key, is a necessary condition for the emergence of military revisions. For theory, and this is exactly what I'm working right now, we are trying to reformulate the traditional conception of revision states because we see the problem that is creating. So if we label correctly revisionist states and we remove the ideological factor that exists in realism from after the Cold War context, we will be able to understand what is revisionism and how to deal with it. But we also need policy, and we need policy because we need to integrate China in the world. Why? Because it's going to be the only way to avoid a major war, and this is key. We need to do that through peaceful changes on the status quo. If it's not possible to change the status quo peacefully, because the system is so rigid, because you don't get enough flexibility for some different perspective, if we want to create a system that is going to be homogeneous, then it's not going to be possible to create any kind of change. And I believe that, as it's the case right now with Russia and Ukraine, but more importantly with the US and the challenge between US and China, it's the test of our times, and we need to deal with it. We need to work on this as much as possible because it's a real chance to understand international relations once for all. So thank you so much.
Thank you, Pablo, for your presentation and for so much topics for us to think together. I will give the floor to Veronica, but before that, I want to present her. So Veronica Strina is a PhD student in Diplomacy and International Cooperation at University for Foreigners of Perugia. Her research interests focus on China cultural projection, the implications of China's soft power in Europe, and its impact on the US cultural hegemony. She is also a collaborator of the Chinese Museum of Parma and a member of the Italian Association of Chinese Studies and the European Association of Chinese Studies. So, Veronica, I will give you the floor immediately.
Thank you very much, Cátia, for the presentation and for having me here today. It was a pleasure to listen to Pablo's presentation. I mean, I really learned many new things today. So thank you very much for this insightful presentation. And I'm really and obviously positively impressed about your work and the detailed analysis that you offer today of such a complex and big phenomenon as China's revisionism. So you managed to cover a great scale of subjects, which will probably not have neither the time nor enough knowledge and competence to comment in depth. But I will try to offer some points for reflection, which I hope maybe will be useful for your future work and also for our audience. So yeah, I much agree with the fact that it's clear that the emergence of China's and Russia's challenges to the post-Cold War has set the stage for a new momentum in the study of revisionism. And I believe that your theoretical framework could give like a real contribution to the understanding of Beijing's stance, as it questions Beijing as a game changer, and considering also the dissatisfaction as one of the main causes of its revisionism. And I think that you got this point really well, because I agree that is one of the main reason. But most of the debate over the implication of China's rise tends to dichotomize around either status quo or revisionist predictions, while the reality seems to lie somewhere in between, I think. So I might agree with Branslin's argument that China challenge to international order is likely to be partial and selective rather than holistic and systemic. So this means being supportive of the status quo in certain areas while being quite forceful in pushing Chinese ideas and initiatives in other domains, policy domains. So I think that the oversimplification of the Chinese role as a status quo or revisionist power derives probably also from the Western mistake sometimes to think about China as having only one voice and one single view, which is not the case. There are many Chinas. Probably we should refer to China always by using the plural. So for this reason, the idea that Beijing is or wants to be like a wholly status quo or a wholly revisionist power seems to be somehow problematic. I think there are good reasons for expecting China to challenge the liberal order, and partially it has already done this type of work. So if you think about China's interests were not there at the creation of the existing institutions of global economic governance, which somehow still reflects the geopolitical realities of the 1944 rather than the distribution of power that we have today. So there are for sure parts of the liberal order that are far from the Chinese preferences, for example, norms relating to sovereignty and intervention. But there are other areas where Beijing's want to push for a change in the already existing institutions, so assume more power within the already existing frameworks. And for example, the global economic governance could prove this point. So when it comes to debating China, I think that probably the idea of a selective reformist agenda is perhaps more appropriate. So on one hand, Beijing is showing signs of dissatisfaction with, of course, the American-led order. But on the other hand, it would also seem showing satisfaction with those aspects that have allowed its development so far. So as you pointed out, the starting point is for sure a long-lasting dissatisfaction with the distribution of power within the major institution of global governance, which translates into what China says, improving global economic governance and promoting the democratization of international relations. Of course, here democratization has to be understood in the Chinese sense, but as you mention it, without mentioning actually the initiative, but I think that in this regards, the Global Development Initiative is really important and relevant because it aims to support developing countries in poverty alleviation, in public health, and other issues. But it also, of course, places questions about its impact in other countries, in these countries of the Belt and Road Initiative. So yeah, I agree that to understand China's logic, we should think for sure about its way of understanding multilateralism. I think this is a big point, probably the first one. And I think that the conceptualization of multilateralism is a key difference between China and the liberal West. So here comes the importance of the Chinese characteristics and the synthesization of global norms, which explain why China will never become like the West liberal states. And the 20th Congress posed a great emphasis on the Chinese characteristics, more than the socialism probably. And so on the Chinese dream that belongs first and foremost to China before than the rest of the world. So by developing its own distinctive and national understanding, I think that the Chinese system does not present itself as an alternative to the Western system, but for sure it weakens the argument for the exclusive legitimacy of the Western system, as you actually said in your presentation. So I think that the key word could be contestation. And I think that the literature on contestation, the theory of contestation of Wiener could also be of great interest to look into, and its application, its possible application also to the Chinese case. And I think that also to understand better the Chinese logic, we should also probably look into the Chinese revisionist strategy towards the regional security order, because this refers, of course, how states pursue security in their regions and, of course, via maintenance of distribution of power, but also through more collective solutions. So I think that also this collective solution and the new role in this of the Global Security Initiative could be really important. And as you said, you mentioned it as actually you call it prestige. I would say status probably. I think that, yeah, the other point is China's international status that remains for sure a central issue in China participation in international affairs. But status does not have to be a zero-sum game, so actors can improve their own status without, of course, cancel the status of another actor. And so I think that in this regards, China is trying to activate a kind of soft bandwagoning mechanism, which also relies on cultural sources. So, and here I will come probably after on the cultural side. But yeah, so I think that the future of China's challenge to the international order depends also on the level of consensus that it's able to generate. And in this sense, I think it will be useful to think about China as a world hegemon, as a possible world hegemon, but not only as a consequence of the objectives that it wants to pursue, but also as the result of the credibility of its geopolitical project. So in understanding China's interest, probably it's also important to understand other states' interest, collective interest, because that's one of the driving force of China's geopolitical project. So the power transition, of course, is not only about the preferences of the rising, but also has to take into consideration the dynamics of other predominant powers too. So I think in this sense, the BRI could offer an empirical case. For example, if we think about its narrative, the win-win narrative, or the mankind with a shared future, it clearly shows a worldview that doesn't include the US. So I think that's the biggest point, because the Belt and Road Initiative excludes completely the US from the picture. And so here I think that to understand also this type of revisionism, it's also important to look at the narratives. I think that's another key word, the narratives that because China having emerged from the era of keeping a low profile, actually China made clear that it wants to have a greater voice in international order, and Beijing has a story to tell, and which is structured in the same way, of course, of Western democracies, for example, Make America Great Again, or Get Brexit Done. So this is actually a topos of great powers. But the most important difference that I see is that the teller of the story, as also Carrie Brown says, is the Chinese party. And this is way more complex than the other actors, because it's made, of course, of networks of agents that is way more complex to analyze. So the main objectives of these storytellings are twofold. And on one hand, there is to ensure that China has a geopolitical space that is, of course, like according to China, rightfully its own space, but at the same time reassure that the world is in a process in a new process that will give everyone benefits. So China's project could actually be helpful for the worldwide community. And so that's why before being geopolitical projects, the BRI, the global security initiatives are narratives to attract international consensus on the on Chinese goal of contributing to the existing international order, which is right now in favor of a Western architecture. And I see that also China's stance in the Russian-Ukraine war is also an example, because despite maintaining a cautious and equilibrious attitude in this crisis, Beijing is also presenting the image of a concerned external party to the conflict, and it has developed its own narrative of a humanitarian assistance, of safety for civilian, and so on. So yeah, to conclude, I just say that I don't see probably a Chinese-led world order as available option as now, but instead we should expect, as you rightfully pointed out, probably a world order in which there are significant Chinese challenges and readjustments to the status quo in some policy domains, which probably will undermine the strength of the liberal arguments. So to explain Beijing's attitude, I think that could also be useful probably to look at the preventive revisionism, as it was called by Andorino, which indicates Beijing's resistance to the American attempts to reinterpret and in a more interventionist sense, the principle of the Westphalian order, which was based on the non-interference. So I think that China, even in this case of revisionism, has developed its own brand of revisionism that relies on the stability of the international system. So the status quo is important to China, for China to, of course, develop its global partnership network. And so, as you pointed out, one of the main, probably the first goal of Xi Jinping as now is to make the one-party system sustainable. So it's the maintenance of the party system, and telling the right story of China is probably the main tool to achieve this type of stability. But this story is a story that is morally right. So after the victimization and, as you said, the century of the humiliation, China's new role in international relation is first about a moral renaissance. So that's why it's important to ask, what are Chinese values? So what China means for moral? What does China imply for moral values? And this is the real questions, because it also leads to resisting certain Western values, as we already seen. So that's why I think that there is like a cultural actually challenge and form of somehow revisionism, even if it's more preventive. It has also been included in the concept of security, which is like a comprehensive concept, and it entails also cultural security. And so probably we see these aspects less with the EU, because Europe and China are both a civilization and could be civilization partners. But this, of course, excludes the US, because the US doesn't have the history that China has, and it's characterized by the paradox. So as a cultural challenges, of course, we could look at the academic Silk Road or the Confucius Institutes around the world that prove this point. I think that China, it's clear that it's developing its higher education and research system at like an incredible speed, and is actively seeking to cooperate with academic partners along the new Silk Road. So, of course, there are some questions like China is clearly boosting the internationalization of Chinese higher education institution, but it's unclear how this new relationship will affect the European, for example, higher education and research, and more in general, the development of the new Silk Road. But I think that the people-to-people dimension of the new Silk Road is really important to understand probably, and under research, as you suggested at the end of your presentation, to understand also the revisionism of the China's agenda. So yeah, I mean, I think that probably I already touched many points, so I don't know. I think that I could also stop here. Last point that I want to touch, because you put like the question whether Taiwan could be the next Kiev. I don't think that. I think that the parallelism between Kiev and Taiwan is a bit misleading. They are not the same. Taipei should not compare itself to Kiev in its attempt to internationalize an internal Chinese affair, because Taiwan is, of course, according to Xi Jinping's idea, something that has to stay in China, and it doesn't, of course, it's not part of the UN. So that also makes a difference. And unlike Putin, China is not threatening the territorial integrity of a country that is part of the United Nations. And this is a distinction that was also pointed out by Wang Yi at the Munich Security Conference. So for China to attack Taiwan would mean admitting the failure of the effectiveness of the one country, two system model. So view from China, attacking Taiwan would mean attacking itself. And so it would not probably be the best case scenario. I'm not saying that it will never do it, but I'm saying that this parallelism is probably misleading as other parallelism that probably we can have, for example, between Putin or Hitler, because of course we are talking about different contexts and different periods, but of course there are similarities. There are similarities, especially in addressing the US as the main responsible for all these crises. So if something will happen to Taiwan, of course the fault will be of the US, as it was in the Ukrainian case. So yeah, that's it, I think, from my side. I mean, I really enjoyed really much. And yeah, I hope that these comments will made sense for you and that you found them useful. And yeah, I'm willing to hear also from all of you, and I would leave the floor to the audience if there are questions for Pablo. I guess there are many. Thank you.
Thank you, Veronica. So Pablo, if you want briefly to answer some issues raised by Veronica, please do it. Then we will open the floor to the public. Okay.
Okay. Thank you so much, Cátia. As always, it's a pleasure to hear from you, Veronica, all your very insightful input on China, which of course I'm not a huge expert in China. I should have warned that from the very beginning. But I still working on China as a case study, but it's always great to have input from sinologists on this. So first of all, I think, and I think there are like mainly 1-2 points that could be connected somehow. This is why I believe, so I don't think that if we divide revisionism, like the continuum for revisionism, on continuism, reformism, revisionism, I don't think that China in political, military affairs or cultural affairs is a continuist. It's a reformer, and this is like the middle point that has never been considered before in the literature, and this is something that we're involved in. It's kind of the contestation that you mentioned. So that, thank you so much for the term. I will definitely use it. But yeah, we consider that reform is the partial revision of the system. It's something that Raymond Aron mentions, that there are 2 types of changes: changes within the system or changes of the system. China right now in political, military affairs, cultural affairs is not proposing a change of the system. They are proposing a change within the system because, of course, they are getting they agree with some of the norms in the system, and because, as you mentioned, they are getting somehow benefits from the system because this is the status that they have achieved today. So yeah, I believe that the key to see if it will be a final reform or a revision of the system is especially the exclusivity character of the system. What you mentioned, that is like one of the big points right now in international dynamics. Is the US going to allow these changes as Great Britain did before with the US? That's going to be key, because Great Britain would have waged war against the US at the turn of the 19th to 20th century, but they did not, because they believed that it was not a huge change of the system. It was just changes within the system. eventually, especially after the two world wars, there was kind of a change with the bipolarity after the Second World War, but it was not a change of the system when it was created. So if the US is going to defend or is going to stand with the point that the system cannot be flexible, that the system is exclusive, that this is their opportunity. I think the civilizational discourse that you mentioned, that it's necessarily excluding the US, is also very important here. I think that, according to power transition theory, there are two keys, as you mentioned, with the dynamics of the system. There could be a major war because of the ambition of the challenger, or because of the resistance of the hegemonic power in decline. If the US is considering that the system should pertain only to democracies, that there's no place for a communist state in global governance, if it's not possible to integrate any other actor that could, let's say, share their power in the Pacific theater, it depends on the rigidity of the system that the US is going to impose within the system. I think that also creates the strategy for China, because, yeah, I agree. In these terms, if the US is going to get to that perspective, China is very different. But I also think that China is, at the end, I'm a realist, you know it. I think China is led through realist concerns as any other power. Of course, they maintain this win-win narrative, which is great, and it's great that they talk about some things like status or prestige, as we discussed, but not considering as a zero-sum game. Of course, China is looking for some things because they have much more experience in international affairs than the US. They are looking for some of the topics that are not confrontational. So they are not going to give any kind of excuse to the US to wage war against them. But eventually, it depends on the US position as well. If China could give no excuse, but still, propaganda during the Cold War against any kind of communism is still very relevant. And the fact that you still in American literature, Anglo-Saxon literature, you still link China with authoritarian regimes, with no respect of human rights, with the kind of revenge and revival of geopolitics, challenging the stability and the peace achieved in the Pacific. If you continue with this discourse, it will eventually lead to considering that the exclusivity character of the system is a systemic factor of the current international system. And then China will have to become revisionist, not only a reformist. But I agree eventually with what you said. It's also very interesting, the Taiwan point that you mentioned, and at the end, China won in this geopolitical space, but a model that is finally kind of giving profits to everyone. And what is the place of Taiwan in that? And this is why I believe that the cultural narrative should change towards Taiwan before getting any kind of intervention, military intervention in the island, because you need to explain at a certain point, without shooting on the foot, as you mentioned, that the idea of one China it's somehow threatened by outsiders, and it will certainly be a confrontation with the West. This is why China has not launched yet any kind of intervention in Taiwan, because again, China is avoiding any kind of confrontation with the US. This guy is trying to avoid any kind of problem directly with the US. They are simply excluding the US, considering that there are other grounds to get profits. There are other areas where they can import the Chinese model. And essentially it's economic, and it's the Eurasian continent. But still, at a certain point, we will have to see how it goes. And I think this narrative, this idea that Beijing has a story to tell, I think it's super important. And that remind me to the Xi Jinping's after his inauguration in 2013. He said that China had a dream. Using the famous sentence by Martin Luther King Jr. And I think that's also true. And China has a dream of a world that is not exclusive, which is essentially the thing that is they are pointing out over the American system. Unipolarity, hegemony is kind of exclusive terms that are not integrating other powers. This is why China is becoming a model for developing countries, for and this win-win narrative, this peaceful coexistence. And I think that moral renaissance that you mentioned, this cultural revisionism, that we do not fully agree on that, but this cultural challenge that China is somehow starting to import, that is going to be key, because you will see their intentions according to the narrative that they are going to develop over the West, especially over the US.
So thank you, Pablo. I will open the floor for the public if you want to make some questions or commentaries. Or maybe not. I have myself some comments, so
okay.
After the manifestation of our public, or not. Well, I have some comments. I think your exercise, Pablo, is very interesting from the theoretical point of view. But I do think you have to have knowledge about China. China is a very specific, has its own specific way of doing international politics. So to classify China without doing that within theories that were made from a Western perspective always gets a risk. For instance, the case of Taiwan is a high risk to consider as a peer of Ukraine, because it's recognized by the US, which is the hegemonic power, as part of Chinese territory. More than this, it is considered that someone representative from the authorities of Washington has to consult Beijing before going to Taiwan. What Nancy Pelosi did was not doing it, so she was challenging the agreement the US have with China, for instance. Or for instance, another thing you say is that China does not have alliances with anyone, only partnerships, not alliances. And it is not, you can say, well, it's a changing of words. It's not a changing of words. It's much more than that. It's something very, very deep. It has to do with the way China sees herself in international politics. Another interesting aspect that you were mentioning is about China's dissatisfaction within the international order, but it begins with the financial problems. China has a currency that cannot be converted. And when you were doing this topic list of all the changes that made the US and Western countries look in a different way to China, it has to be with the fact that if you compare, if you look to science and technology index, patents index, or economic indexes, you will see that China is a very competent competitor and skilled competitor for these countries. So this has influence and political impact. It's not only, although the ones coming from political area as ourselves, it's very attractive to consider always this from the political perspective, but it's much more. It's real world, and real world is very, very complex. Another interesting thing when we are talking about revisionism based on hegemonic theories, so it's always about changing the hegemonic power. But when you look to the Ukrainian war and we say, well, Putin challenged the order by invading the country, a UN country. But before that, there was a previous challenge that was NATO's frontiers coming towards the Russian frontiers. So this was something that was agreed it was not going to happen. So who was challenging what? So when we are looking from the hegemonic theories, we are always looking from the hegemonic power. But when you are looking for international politics, it's much more complex. So I enjoyed it, but I was thinking that really for the Chinese case, and the Bandung Conference is really a starting point. And it's why now you can have BRICS, or you have this demanding for multipolar world, for multilateral organizations. So it's really challenging the traditional way Western countries saw international relations. So I think another point I would like to highlight is that sometimes we are always talking about stories and narratives, but before that, there are the discourses, which is not the same. The discourses are prevailing now to change the narrative, and the narrative is telling the story afterwards. It's for the past. But during this period, what you have is a confrontation of discourses, because discourses build up the narrative, and we are still building this narrative of changing order, of challenging order. So this is in international relations. I know sometimes this is all mixed, but it's not. I work a lot about discourse. That's why I'm doing this, because I think it's really interesting to see how Chinese discourse evolved, and you see that the pillars are really the ones that Xu and Lai presented in Bandung Conference. That did not change. So this is interesting to see how they have a specific international policy or foreign policy. So thank you so much. And I open the floor again for anyone who wants to do. I did a lot of comments. So.
Can I answer you, Cátia?
Yes,
first?
Of course. Yes.
Yeah. I totally agree with what you said. I mean, I'm actually, when I studied my thesis, when I studied my dissertation, I wanted to get away from the Western perspective and have a let's say a non-Western input on this. But I think after reading more, after talking more to specialists, I think the first thing we need to do is to challenge the Western perspective. And it's not based on not only on China, it's based in general. I mean, the Western international relations theory, it's very problematic because it's based on certain pillars that should not be part of any kind of scientific field. If we understand, for example, this is very illustrative, when we talk about the theological factor when defining revisionism has tried to be a scientific neutral standpoint, but how it has been developed is not possible because the ideological factor was necessarily included there. So we need to remove that, and this is what I'm trying to do. Of course, I use Western terminology because it's the one that I want to challenge. But I'm trying to integrate with the knowledge that I have, of course, some other factors. And so yeah, I try to use somehow or in a way the hegemonic perspective, but it's just because I want to challenge it, to create a differentiation on that. I totally agree with the issue of Taiwan. So what I was only pointing out is that there is this idea of IR theory right now about Taiwan becoming the next Ukraine. I don't think so. It's not possible. And again, it's so different context because of the position of China in this situation, also in the international context, as you mentioned. And yeah, I think dissatisfaction is key also on economic factors, as you mentioned, with the currency. And these are some of the things that should probably be more research on IR theory, and with this combination between Chinese studies and IR theory, because I think, again, I feel like when I'm working on IR theory, it's I try to go to some Chinese accounts on IR theory, but it's true that at least the classic words are always Western, which doesn't mean that they are good. And this is the transformation that I see we are producing on IR theory, but it's of course going to be slow to get this huge change in the theoretical literature. But thank you so much for all these comments, and I'm really part of this movement to challenge all the hegemonic perspective in theoretical affairs, and to integrate some other factors that are normally excluded in the literature. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Pablo. Well, I want to thank specifically Pablo and Veronica for joining us. It was really interesting. And I really enjoyed not only the presentation Pablo did, but also the comments Veronica did. So I think they are a very good starting point for other reflections. I know we have here more researchers with us, so I think it will be useful also for them. I invited you to return to these seminars as speakers or as a public, and you are very welcome. And I think we can finish our session. Just remember, everyone, that we will have a next session in March. We don't have the precise date, but we'll have soon, and we will start making the publicizing it as soon as we have it decided. So thank you so much for joining us today, and see you soon.
Thank you so much for the opportunity, Cátia, and thank you so much, Vero, for the all her intervention. Thank you so much.
Thank you for your insights. Bye.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye. Bye. Bye. Thank you.